In May 1933, John Herbert Dillinger had been paroled from Indiana State Prison after serving 9 years on a 10 to 20 sentence for a botched robbery on a local grocer. When he returned home to Mooresville, Indiana, he swore to everyone that he was going straight. But he'd chosen a life of crime, with big plans to rob America blind. His buddies at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City were planning to break out. They had taught him all they knew about robbing banks and stores so he could gather enough money to fund their prison escape. This wasn't gonna be easy. The United States was in the middle of the Great Depression, and finding banks and stores to rob would prove a challenging task. I am Yvette, this is Deep Frank History, and thank you for tuning in to episode 2 of the story of John Dillinger, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. Harry Pete Pierpont, serving 10 to 20 years in Indiana State Prison for robbery with little chance of parole, had given John Dillinger the easy jug list, names and locations of the most poorly protected banks and stores in the Midwest that would be easy to rob. He also gave Johnny a list of associates who could help him. On June 4th, 1933, 2 weeks after his parole, Dillinger contacted a fellow parolee on Pierpont's list, Noble Claycomb. He agreed to rob a supermarket that evening, but they needed a third man. Claycomb took Johnny to a baseball field at Spades Park and introduced him to members of the Whitecap Gang, a group of young thugs who staged small stick-ups in and around Indianapolis. 19-year-old William the Kid Shaw and Paul Lefty Parker weren't sure about letting this 29-year-old Dan join the gang, but they agreed to at least do the job. They first headed to a saloon called Shorty George's to rent guns from owner George Hughes, who moonlighted as a weapons broker. Johnny selected a fancy long-barreled Colt .32-20. It packed a punch but was difficult to conceal. Next, the gang needed a car. They stole a DeSoto sedan. The car had out-of-state license plates, and Shaw had to steal plates from another vehicle to swap them out. Cops patrolling in a police car saw him. Claycomb turned off the lights and floored it before Shaw could close the rear door. It smashed against the telephone pole with a loud crash, busting one of its hinges. It just dangled there. Claycomb managed to shake off the police and pulled over. They wired the door shut and headed for one of the new supermarkets, a City Foods Incorporated market. The Whitecap Gang circled the place, then parked the car. The gang handed Dillinger colored glasses and a white cap. Was this a joke? No. You see, witnesses would be too distracted by the glasses and caps to notice faces. Hence, Whitecap Gang, get with the program, man. Johnny reluctantly put on the disguise. This was monumentally stupid. Everybody would know a robbery was about to go down the moment these white cappers walked in. Dillinger and Shaw headed in and strolled toward the store's office. But clerk Irene Quigley noticed the caps, the glasses, and the Colt's barrel poking out of Dillinger's jacket. She hollered to manager Walter Reeves, "Whitecap Gang!" Dillinger was like, "What did I tell ya?" Shaw pulled out his automatic, pushed Irene into the office, and snatched up $100 worth of bills from a register on the go. Meanwhile, out in front, Dillinger waved his Colt to herd everyone to the back of the store. An elderly man didn't move, perhaps too frightened to follow orders. Johnny became frustrated, and 6 days after apologizing to grocer Frank Morgan for stalking him, he whacked the man across the face with the Colt's barrel. The victim spat out so many teeth that everyone, including Shaw, froze in horror. Dillinger had busted the man's dentures. The Whitecap duo quickly exited the store and were scooped up by Claycomb and the DeSoto. The robbery was total amateur hour, but Dillinger thought it was a roaring success. He had put his life on the line, risked another long prison term, and trusted a driver he barely knew for the take of $30, his share. The following day, Johnny was a perfect angel to his parole officer. What was he doing? Well, you know, just working on the farm with my dad, looking for a new job, though it was hard because of his prison record. Listeners, he wasn't helping his dad on the farm, and he had already found a new job. Professional bank robber. On June 10, 1933, at 8 a.m., bookkeeper Horace Grissow unlocked the front door of the new Carlisle National Bank and headed into the teller's cage. There stood 3 men, faces covered with handkerchiefs. Well, that's never a good sign. Earlier that night, John Dillinger, William Shaw, and Paul Parker had snuck in through an open window and waited for Grissow. Dillinger said, "All right, buddy, open the safe." Grissom got the bank's combination book but was so nervous he failed to open the lock twice. Shaw said, "Let me drill him, he's stalling." Dillinger raised his hand, shush, and told Grissom to take his time. When the bank clerk arrived, Dillinger gallantly spread a banker's smock on the floor. He apologized, but she had to lie down and be tied up by hands and feet. After Grissom opened the safe, John tied him up as well. While Shaw and Parker lifted out the bags of cash, Dillinger herded a cashier and a customer behind the cage. He told the customer with a grin, "You hadn't ought to come into the bank so early." Minutes later, the Whitecappers were back in their car, racing toward Indianapolis. It was a small bank in the Depression era, but they netted $10,660 in cash, over $250,000 in today's dollars. But Dillinger needed much more money for his prison buddy's escape plan and persuaded William Shaw to help him stage 2 more robberies that evening. Wheelman Noble Claycomb wasn't available for the Whitecappers' next 2 gigs, so Paul Parker, the gang's backup driver who had never driven a getaway car before, would give it a whirl. Paul double parked outside a Hogg's drugstore. Shaw donned his glasses and white cap, but Dillinger was like, "Nah, man," and wore a sailor straw hat instead. To prevent the whole screaming clerk mess from the first holdup, he and Shaw entered the store with guns drawn and loudly announced this was a stick-up. Shaw headed toward the main cash register while Dillinger emptied a smaller one at the soda fountain. Dillinger noticed the herded-up customers were staring at him and ordered them to turn around. They did, but moments later they were facing him again. Dillinger angrily told them to turn around. He didn't know Shaw didn't like having an audience either, and now the 2 bandits were spinning the hostages like round tops. When they'd grabbed what they'd come to grab, the duo scrammed. Outside was Lefty, smiling ear to ear. "Check out my mad parallel parking skills." He'd wedged the fort tightly between 2 cars. Seriously? 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 Lefty knew he'd messed up and butted his way free and drove off, while Dillinger and Shaw passionately lectured him the rules of parking a getaway car. Never ever parallel park. After Parker had been sufficiently lectured, the Whitecappers headed for a Kroger store and cased the neighborhood. However, Shaw seemed to know an awful lot about the place. Dillinger was like, "You hit this store before or something?" No." Well, they had, less than a month before. So, when the duo walked in, guns drawn, the manager merely sighed and said, "Uh-oh, here they are again." Shaw checked the drawers and only found a few small bills. The manager was like, "Ha, ha." Since the last robbery, the company started collecting their cash more frequently. The collector had just left. Dillinger stalked out of the store, but the kid grabbed an armful of tin cigarette boxes. Lefty had dutifully remained double-parked and eased forward when he saw the guys leaving the store. Johnny hopped in the front, but before Shaw could jump in the back, nervous Parker hit the accelerator and left the Whitecapper, arms full of cigarette tins, screaming in the middle of College Avenue. Shaw started running after the vanishing Ford. Dillinger told Parker to stop. Lefty instead threw the gear in reverse and floored it, nearly running over the panting Shaw. The kid jerked the door open, dumped the cigarette tins into the seat, and slipped inside. Parker sped off and ran a stop sign. "Jeez Louise," Dillinger said, "if you can't drive, let the kid have the wheel." The total hold was $3,600. Not bad, but not good enough. Dillinger still needed more money to fund his friends' jailbreak. And he needed a better king. As Dillinger and the Whitecappers returned to his father's farmhouse in Mooresville, 3 Dallas natives were speeding through the Texas Panhandle in the dark. The driver missed a road sign and the car plummeted off a busted bridge into a ravine below. Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Clyde's gopher, a teenager named W.D. Jones, were all saved from the fiery crash. However, Bonnie's stockings had melted into her skin. She didn't want to risk seeing a doctor and teetered at death's door for a week, but survived. A few days after this crash, on June 15, 1933, the Barker Karpis gang kidnapped brewer William Ham in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and demanded a hefty ransom. At the same time, Charles Arthur Floyd, aka Pretty Boy Floyd, was in a garage getting a stolen car fixed when Sheriff Jack Killingsworth entered and recognized him from the wanted posters. Floyd kidnapped the sheriff and managed to elude police by frequently hopping stolen vehicles. On June 16th, Floyd parked the latest stolen Pontiac outside Kansas City, Missouri, waiting for nightfall to enter the town unseen with his hostage. On that same day, agents of the Bureau of Investigation arrested Frank Nash, an old YEG and prison escapee connected to George Barnes, aka Machine Gun Kelly, in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Because local law enforcement could be on the gangster's payroll, the feds figured it would be safer to take the overnight train to Kansas City. However, an Associated Press reporter got wind of the plot and published an article about the arrest and the train ride. The underworld quickly assembled the Avengers. On June 17th, Floyd entered Kansas City and switched cars again. He released his hostage and told the sheriff to wait 5 minutes after he left, then take the Pontiac and scram. A little later, at 7 a.m., the train carrying the feds and their prisoner pulled into Kansas City train station. A phalanx of officers escorted Frank Nash toward a waiting police car. As everyone hustled into the car, someone yelled, "Up! Up! Get your hands up!" A split second later, a hail of bullets mowed down agents and cops in and around the vehicle. When the smoke cleared, 4 officers were dead, 2 were wounded, and the object of the rescue operation, Frank Nash, was a goner as well. No one was caught, since no one knew who did the shooting. Vern Miller was certainly one of them, but many believe Pretty Boy Floyd, who had just rolled into town, was also there. He denied this till the day he died. The ruthlessness of the Kansas City attack, the second most lethal on law enforcement at the time, shocked the nation. People were used to a bit of violence, but this was next level. The director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, all but popped the champagne. He christened the assault the Kansas City Massacre and waved it around as proof that the nation was a lawless frontier, mismanaged by corrupt local police agencies. It was high time the United States got a federal police whose officers couldn't be bribed. Hoover declared, "Whoever did this must be exterminated, and they must be exterminated by us." Within hours of the shooting, the special agents of the Bureau of Investigation, who had never been allowed to carry guns before, got all the weapons and were ordered to learn how to use them. When the news of the William Ham kidnapping broke the same day, everyone was even more eager for action. The brewer was freed after the ransom drop. Embarrassingly, the Bureau couldn't figure out who was behind the kidnapping. They blamed and interrogated every gang and gangster in existence, but it took them forever to uncover the real culprits, the Barker Karpis gang. United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed 9 major anti-crime bills into law, which would federalize crimes like bank robbery, extortion, and transporting stolen goods across state lines. He also gave Hoover's Bureau a ton of extra powers. The war on crime began. Well, settle down there, Skippy. Congress still had to sign off on the bills, and states doing state things, they weren't very eager to surrender state rights so easily. Anti-federalism ran strong in America. Citizens in the South and Midwest in particular deeply mistrusted Washington politicians whom they felt were to blame for the Great Depression. Congress held up passing the crime bills, but they folded like a cheap suit after another shootout. This one had John Dillinger in the starring role, but we're not there yet. The day after his 30th birthday, June 23, 1933, John Dillinger and Shaw scouted an Indianapolis bank. It was boarded up. Dillinger and his buddies had entered prison during the Roaring '20s, but he had been paroled into the Great Depression and a world he hardly recognized. There was massive unemployment, breadlines, Hoovervilles, beggars, and many boarded-up banks and businesses. Added to this, an extreme drought and the Dust Bowl era disaster was complete in both city and countryside. People lost faith in the American dream, which claimed that as long as you worked hard and lived responsibly, you could make it. The newly elected President Roosevelt tried to fulfill his campaign promise that happy days are here again. He took the U.S. off the gold standard, declared a bank holiday, and phased out the failed prohibition to end the bloodshed of warring bootleg mobs to create new jobs. He launched the New Deal, a series of measures focused on the 3 R's: relief for the unemployed and for the poor, recovery of the economy, and reform of the financial system to prevent another depression. But none of this had had an effect yet. People raged against the evil banks who forced them out of their homes. Most were simply shocked into apathy. For Dillinger, it meant that nearly half of the robbable places on Pierpont's list had gone belly up. and of the list of associates, only few were available since most were dead, imprisoned, or had moved to parts unknown. Shaw was like, "Yo, Mr. D, that easy jug list is totally bunk. Let's rob some more markets and stores. Sure, the takes are smaller, but so are the risks." Dillinger and Shaw drove 80 miles north to rob assistant manager Fred Fisher of the Marshall Fields thread mill in Monticello, Indiana on the mill's payday. The man, who had a limp, always walked up the hill to the bank to get the payroll for the mill's employees. The duo would wait at the end of the street, jump the man as he hobbled back, and grab all the cash. Easy street. On June 24th, Shaw parked a stolen 1932 DeSoto sedan and cased the neighborhood. But assistant manager Fisher left the mill, went up a side street, and disappeared. The duo raced to the bank and saw him inside collecting payroll. How did he get there so fast? They rushed to the end of the street to jump him, only to see Fisher drive right past them in his car. Rats! Fisher's wife had seen the dynamic duo acting all suspicious and warned her husband not to walk to the bank this time. New plan. They'd raid the mill itself. Dillinger went inside to apply for a job so he could case the joint, but he saw the girls counting money in the office by the front door and tiptoed right out. However, he'd been seen. New plan. Now Shaw would go in and apply for a job. When one of the girls opened the door, he'd force her back into the office at gunpoint and slam the door behind him to signal Dillinger to come in. Shaw knocked on the door of the main office, but another door 25 yards down opened instead, and a stenographer beckoned him. New plan. Shaw pressed a .45 in her back and slammed the door, but it was too far down the corridor for Dillinger to hear it. He remained waiting outside, wondering what took Shaw so long. In the office, Fisher didn't put up his hands as expected and instead grabbed the gun and tried to yank it away from Shaw. The freak teen dropped the gun and ran past Dillinger into the car, with Fisher coming after him brandishing the gun. Dillinger leaned out the car window and shot in Fisher's general direction. One bullet ricocheted off the building and hit the assistant manager in the left leg. The factory whistle started shrieking, followed by the alarm at City Hall. Two bumbling bandits had not made a map of the escape route, and got lost on a dirt road. After 50 miles, they finally got back on the highway, a mere 12 miles from the mill. There was an ambulance dead ahead, hauling Fisher to the hospital. New plan. They'd rob a bakery in Muncie. Alas, another depression victim. New plan. Shaw knew an open-air fruit market in Indianapolis where several weapons were kept, including a Thompson machine gun, the gangster's weapon of choice. Dillinger was like, well, at least the day isn't completely fruitless. After dinner and a change of clothes, Shaw and Dillinger headed to the open-air fruit market at 10th and Bellefontaine. They strategically parked the car some 50 feet from the corner, entered the market, pulled their weapons, and ordered a clerk to hand over the money. He gave them $175. Well, it was sour grapes, because just when Shaw wanted to demand the Thompson, he saw a boy who lived across the street from him. He ducked and whispered to Dillinger, "We're out." Dillinger grabbed more money while Shaw hustled for the car. When Johnny ran off, someone threw a milk bottle at him. It shattered on the sidewalk at his feet. Dillinger whirled around and aimlessly fired a round from his long-barreled Colt. How do you like them apples? The final haul was $350. Not bad. Shaw's share ended up in Shorty George's pockets for the loss of his rented gun left at the mill. Dillinger decided to invest his share in himself and got a makeover. He ditched the cheap wrinkled prison-issued suit and was now sporting a dapper outfit with vest and shiny new dress shoes. He got a spiffy new hairdo and a new hat that sat on his head at a snazzy angle. Shaw, figuring his buddy was dressed to rob, decided they should go out robbing again. On Thursday, June 29th, the dynamic duo headed to the bustling Eaton sandwich shop. Not to get a bite to eat, but to get a bite out of the store's take. The waitress nearly fainted, but they got $340. Not bad. The next day, William Shaw married Eufa Benita Height, and while he was making a different kind of bang-bang, Dillinger borrowed the DeSoto to visit another parolee on Pierpont's list, Frank Whitehouse, in Bradfordsville, Kentucky. At the Whitehouse's place in Kentucky, John Dillinger had the stolen DeSoto repainted so it could be used in another heist. Dillinger offered to treat Frank and his wife to a Century of Progress International Exposition, aka the Chicago World's Fair in Chicago, Illinois, which had opened a month earlier. He'd already been there once, and it was awesome. The couple jumped at the offer and volunteered their car as transportation. Underway, Dillinger dropped in on an escapee from Indiana State Prison, a dangerous feller named Clifford Whitey Moeller who was hiding in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Johnny dug Moeller because he was clever and a little different. The all-American man with movie star good looks could have made bank as an actor, but he decided to rob banks instead. Dillinger had gotten Moeller's hideaway address from 41-year-old Sam Goldstein, another parolee on Pierpont's list. Goldstein, or Goldstein, he changed the spelling of his name often to elude officials, had spent most of his adult life behind bars, but he was happy to join a gang again. He and Moeller had successfully robbed a dozen Midwestern banks, often with the assistance of Dillinger's fellow parolee, Homer Van Meter. Dillinger and Whitehouse visited another paroled shirt shop boy, bootlegger Fred Brenman. Johnny, the least experienced among them, sold them all on a grandiose scheme. They'd form a dream team of bank robbers. By the time Dillinger finally pulled into the Chicago's Fair parking lot, he'd received commitments from Moeller, Goldstein, and Brenman. Frank Whitehouse was the only holdout. He wanted in on the action, but worried about his wife's reaction. Dillinger told him not to worry about it, and the three went on to enjoy the spectacular fair. Johnny had spent 9 years living in a cage, but now wandered around the world, visiting the Chinese and Mayan temples, the streets of Paris, the Belgian and Moroccan villages, the Italian, Dutch, and Egyptian pavilions, as well as the South Pole ship. John, a car nut, was mostly drawn to all the car exhibits. The huge General Motors one included an actual assembly line. For some reason, Henry Ford had declined doing something similar, so GM had a huge advantage in the branding department. Ford caved and did display his full line of V8s when, unique at the time, the fair was extended to 1934. The Hudson Motor Car Company display featured the hot new Essex Terraplane 8. John watched a short film which told him that on the water, it's aquaplaning, in the air, it's aeroplaning, on the ground, it's terraplaning. After the film, there was a demonstration of a bold new idea, television. Nobody cared. Dillinger was dreaming of terraplaning away from the police at breakneck speeds, aka 90 miles an hour. He returned to Indianapolis awash in cash from a robbery either in Kentucky or Illinois that was never attributed to him, probably with Whitehouse, Moeller, Goldstein, and Brenman. Then he went to buy a car. Shaw warned him to be careful. Many a robber was caught for making it rain cash after a job, but Dillinger went out to buy a used maroon 1931 Chevrolet 6-cylinder coupe with spiffy red wire wheels for $250, down from the new price of $575. On July 8, 1933, John Dillinger, feeling poor again, wanted in on a job Shaw and Claycomb had been planning. They recruited a fourth man, Hilton Pizzywizzy Crouch, a dirt race car driver turned robber, the ideal wheelman. They would rob the female collector of the Hog Drugs pharmacies in Indianapolis after she picked up the dough from 22 outlets. Yufa dropped off her husband outside the Apollo Theater to steal a car. Shaw jump-started a brand-new Chrysler Imperial 80 Roadster. The next morning, Shaw instructed Crouch not to turn off the car for more than a few seconds, or else he'd burn out the jumper wire used to steal it. Crouch assured Shaw that this wasn't his first rodeo. Dillinger and Crouch took up their position while Shaw and Claycomb went to the collector's next-to-last stop. They warned their partners she was on the way and left them to handle the actual robbery. Half an hour later, no robbers. Shaw and Claycomb figured they were double-crossed, but they found Dillinger and Crouch standing forlornly on the corner. They'd failed because the Chrysler had run out of gas. Shaw knew this was a lie. He had filled the car himself the night before. "You burned the jumper wire, didn't you?" "No." "Yes." Dillinger was like, "Yeah," and Crouch shut off the engine while they were waiting. The robbery was off. Shaw was furious. Crouch has to go. Dillinger persuaded him to keep him on. They needed him for the next bank job. Dillinger's gang hung out in Indiana Harbor, the gangster belt. But the kid and his bride, Yufa, tipped that the cops were onto them, fled to Muncie, Indiana. The B-team, Bonnie and Clyde, hooked up with a 37-year-old Michigan City vet named Harry Copeland, who had done time for a grocery burglary. During a meetup at a speakeasy on High Street, Copeland suggested a hit on a bank in Daleville, a small town 10 miles west of Muncie. Claycomb, Copeland, and Dillinger immediately went to case the joint. John wanted some heavy artillery in case they had problems with the police, and contacted his fellow parolee, Homer Van Meter, who set him up with a broker in Fort Wayne. The weapons pickup turned out to be a bust, and on their way back, Shaw, Claycomb, Copeland, and Dillinger passed a roadhouse, the By the Wee Inn in Muncie, that specialized in barbecue, and figured, why not? No, they were not going to get a bite to eat, they were going to rob it. It went off without a hitch, but the take was a measly $70, a little over $1,650 today. The next morning, after breakfast, Dillinger and Copeland went to park his Chevy in the garage at the rear of the Shaw's apartment. He drove down the alley, but just as he was about to turn into the backyard, he saw Shaw and gang standing near the back stoop with their hands in the air. They were surrounded by half a dozen Muncie police officers. The Whitecappers had been caught totally off guard. Dillinger threw the clutch in reverse and floored it. A week earlier, not used to the late model cars, Dillinger had run off the road and rammed a fence. But now, in a crisis, he deftly backed out of the narrow alley full speed, leaving Shaw, Claycomb, Parker, and Ufa to face the music alone. Johnny and Harry, underarmed and undermanned, decided to do the Daleville bank job alone. Because, well, you know, professional bank robbers. On July 17th, John Dillinger, with Harry Copeland as the wheelman, parked near the commercial bank in the tiny unincorporated town of Daleville, Indiana. Inside the bank were a 22-year-old cashier, Margaret Good, and an open vault. Johnny had painted his maroon Chevy green, but left the wire wheels red, so it stood out like a Christmas tree in July. Dillinger strolled into the little bank like he owned it and asked if the president was in. No, he was away, and the cashier was out to lunch. John brought up his long-barreled gun. "This is a stick-up. Get me the money, honey." Miss Good raised her hands, but Johnny calmly told her to put them back down. He didn't want to attract the attention of citizen variables outside. Good put all the cash on the counter. Dillinger ordered her to open the door that stood between the lobby and the bank's caged working area. Well, she didn't have the key. No problem. Using the ledge of the cage as a step, Dillinger vaulted lightly over the 6-foot barrier. The man had seen way too many Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckling movies. In the vault, John scooped handfuls of cash into a sack. He also scored a rare coin collection, some diamond rings and other valuables. When random customers appeared, Copeland herded them into a corner so Dillinger could continue the cash grab. When Johnny was done, Harry ordered the whole lot, including Miss Good, inside one of the cages. The robbers left through the main entrance unhindered and sped off. The take was $3,500, or over $82,000 today. Newspaper articles called the bank robber who leaped over the railing Desperate Dan. No one knew who he was. The Whitecap gang was done. Witnesses and policemen from all parts of the state hauled ass to the jail to close any lingering Whitecapper cases. John Dillinger didn't know this, but William Shaw was what the kids called back then a rapper. He talked and talked and talked. He admitted to the By the Wee job and 20 other holdups in Indianapolis and threw everyone under the interurban. He said that Dan Dellinger, with an E, also known as John Donovan, had shot and wounded Fred Fisher, the assistant manager of the thread mill. And this Dan was also planning a heist of the Daleville Bank at the suggestion of another feller named Harry Copeland. Not all he said was true, but every time detectives came around for questioning, he dropped a few gold nuggets. Shaw's wife Ufa played all innocent and told the police she was shocked, I tell you, to learn that her husband was a crooked crook. The cops bought her tale of woe and released her. Everyone else was taken to the Delaware County Jail. Shaw was slapped with 10 years in the Indiana Reformatory. Noble Claycomb was sent back to Michigan City. He lamented, "I was in 5 jobs and out of the whole mess only got $85. Add to that this prison sentence and well, it doesn't pay." Parker was charged with the payroll hit of the Leslie Colvin Construction Company and was sent up the creek as well. When Dillinger heard the bad news, he tried to give Shaw's mother some cash to compensate, but she refused this dirty money. She was a Christian. At the time of his parole from the Indiana State Prison, John Dillinger had promised several fellow inmates that he would check in on their relatives and friends. James Jenkins had asked him to visit his 23-year-old sister living in Dayton, Ohio. Mrs. Mary Jenkins, mother of two, was married to Arthur Longacre. However, she was separated from her husband, who had snatched away and hidden the children. Dillinger saw her picture and was like, "Don't mind if I do." He was smitten with the dark-haired beauty, another Frances Thornton stand-in. Now, since his parole, Dillinger had spent many an evening hanging out with the ladies of the night. And by hanging out, I mean, well, you know. But he actually craved love and more than just sex. In July 1933, Johnny drove his Chevy to Mary's apartment to talk to her about bribing the guards at the prison so her brother could escape. She was grateful to Dillinger for helping to break her brother out. Mary and Jimmy had been raised in an orphanage together and were very close. After a little chit-chat, Johnny invited her to lunch downtown at Vargo's restaurant. She wanted her friend, Mary Ann Buckles, to join them. During lunch, John wowed them with stories about the Chicago World's Fair. The next day, Dillinger took Mary and Mary Ann on a road trip to check it out. However, he first stopped by his father's farm in Mooresville. Johnny had become what his father had feared, a professional criminal. But there were no lectures. His son had changed. There was no more sarcasm or no dark looks. Johnny treated his father with affection and care. On his way out, Dillinger drove to Maywood, where he left $10 with a filling station attendant to give to his half-brother Hubert. That is roughly $235 today. Early the following morning, Johnny and the girls checked into the Krillin Hotel in Chicago. The fair, spread out for 5 miles along the shore of Lake Michigan, dazzled the young women. During the 3-day visit, they snapped 5 rolls of film, mostly of each other. Though at one point, John took the camera and got a shot of a smiling Chicago police officer decked out in a pith helmet. He gladly posed for Dillinger. Hilarious. On July 24, 1933, John Dillinger and the girls went home, but not after stopping by the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City so Mary could see her brother. At a farmer's stall, Dillinger bought a fruit basket to give to Jenkins. While parked in front of the prison, he wrapped a $50 bill in dark paper and slid it into a hole he had made in the top of a banana and stopped it up with the pulp. He instructed Mary to tell her brother that $10 in the fruit basket was designated for certain people, and James could keep the rest. He also put $50 in Jenkins' account so he could get his teeth fixed. A day after dropping off the girls at home, he wrote a love letter to Mary. 5 days later, he received a friendly response. Not interested. The next day, he wrote, "Honey, I miss you like nobody's business, and I don't mean maybe. I hope I can spend more time with you, for baby, I fell for you in a big way. And if you'll be on the level, I'll give everybody the go-by for you, and that isn't a lot of hooey either. And if that lousy husband of yours bothers you anymore, just let me know, and he'll never bother you again. Well, sweetheart, I guess I will ring off for this time. Love me a little, or do you love me a lot? Well, baby, ta-da for this time. I hope I hear from you soon. Lots of love, from Johnny." Mary only giggled to friends that Johnny was a hit in the sack. Undeterred, Dillinger visited a lawyer in Dayton to speed along Mary's divorce and said he'd pay for both the divorce and the custody case. He genuinely liked kids and had no problem accepting his sweetheart's ready-made family. But 2 days later, he received another non-committal letter from Mary. Desperate Dan so longed for a steady relationship that he wrote her that he was crazy to see her and he would like to take her with him if she cared enough for him. "Haha, kid, you've sure got me tied up in a knot, but don't leave me dangling, for I want to know something when I see you again. Lots of love, from Johnny." A week later, "Baby, if I can only get Jimmy out, we'll get the kids and leave the country. How in the hell did I know I would fall for you? Honey, I wish you would get your hair fixed up and put on your black gown and have your picture taken, especially for me." In Chicago, Johnny had bought her a gorgeous floor-length satin evening gown. The threats against his latest beloved husband were not idle. He drove to Pleasant Hill with Mary, tracked down Longacre to his workplace, and demanded to know where the kids were. Longacre refused to talk, and the pair began to fight. The supervisor, Ellis Cecil, ran to get Orth Stalker, the town constable who happened to be working nearby. Stalker and some others broke up the fight. Then the unarmed constable herded Dillinger back to his car, stood on the running board, and ordered the hot-headed Romeo to drive into town where he was to be arrested. This was certainly a disaster in the making. When they hit Pleasant Hills Main Street, Dillinger floored it as Constable Stocker hung on for dear life. Outside of town, the bandit skidded to a stop, pushed the stunned lawman off, and sped away. Stocker did pick up some souvenirs for his trouble. Dillinger's hat and a fountain pen with an inscription, D.M. Dillinger. But Mary became Johnny's girl. On Friday afternoon, August 4th, 1933, several NRA, that is, National Recovery Administration committee members, were standing outside the Wells and Wraps meat market directly across from the First National Bank in Montpelier, Indiana. At 2:30 p.m., they saw a large dark blue Chrysler sedan pull up in front of the bank. Hilton Crouch remained in the car, while John Dillinger and Harry Copeland entered the bank. The bank had been robbed by 3 men 3 years earlier, and it had ended ugly. The mayor and police chief, who shared an office over the bank's lobby, had shot at them from their office window, killing one, capturing the 2 others. On this day, however, the mayor, H.L. Kelly, was out of town at the horse races, and police chief E.R. Coleman was at a road construction site 2 blocks away. Dillinger, wearing a straw boater hat and chewing a piece of gum, entered the lobby, drew a revolver, and said with a smile, "This is a stick-up. All we want is your money. Stand still and you won't get hurt." Copeland forced 3 employees onto the floor, and Dillinger leaped over the barrier again, scooped up cash from the counters, and emptied the drawers in the cashier's cage. When a teller reached for an alarm, Dillinger said, "What are you trying to do, set off that alarm?" The woman snapped back, "I would if I could." It was a perfect robbery. A calmer and more experienced Dillinger took $6,200 from the vault and added it to the $3,900 from the cage. He also pocketed the bank's security system, a .45 revolver. When 2 customers arrived mid-robbery, Copeland, waving his .38, forced them to the floor as well. Dillinger asked Bank President Merle D. Tewksbury where the bank's government bond stash was. In a safe, in Fort Wayne. Dillinger and Copeland herded the employees and customers into the vault, then walked out carrying sacks of money. They supposedly left behind 40 cents. According to newspapers, the men pocketed some $12,000. According to Dillinger, it wasn't that much. The NRA men saw the duo leaving the bank carrying bags. One of them joked, "What in the hell do those men have in those sacks? My God, they're robbing the bank. Fred, get that gun, quick!" Dillinger and Copeland passed 2 men leaning against a Kroger store next to the bank building. The men joked, "Look at the money those men have. Let's hold them up." Dillinger only smiled. The robbers then passed an old man standing on Main Street who said, "Looks like the bank's being held up again." Before he got into the Chrysler and drove off, Dillinger turned and smiled, "I'm not surprised." They drove off and weren't followed. Marion County and Hartford City Police did set up roadblocks, but the gang switched cars and the roadblocks were useless. The job went smooth. Maybe a little too smooth. It was almost as if someone tipped them off about the mayor's and police chief's absence. Was this an inside job? Maybe. More on that later. When Dillinger did his swashbuckling act and jumped the railing again, it was recognizable. It was a trademark. It drew the attention of Filip Hatmatia-Lichanin, an immigrant born to Serbian parents who now went by the name Matt Leach, the captain of the Indiana State Police. That jumper was a yegg with a flamboyant streak. That spelled much bigger trouble down the road. Captain Leach became obsessed. Little Mattia arrived in the United States with his mother Mila when he was 12. They joined his father Bojo Lichanin, who'd been working in the steel mills for 10 years, to pay for their passage across. Mattia had to learn English quickly, too quickly, which gave him a stutter. He didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps and joined the Indiana National Guard to hunt down Francisco Pancho Villa, who was on the U.S. military's most wanted list after several bloody raids in New Mexico. After the U.S. entered World War I, Corporal Leach went to Europe to fight, but 2 months after his arrival, the war was over. Leach went home, got an honorable discharge, and joined the Gary Police Department as a diversity hire. There were many Serbians in Gary, Indiana, and they could use him. He was handsome, tall, and slim. His only shortcomings, he missed his left middle finger and had a stutter. After being let go from the police force for not being corrupt enough, he clawed his way into the inner circle of the veterans organization, the American Legion. He drew the attention of its commander, 42-year-old Paul Maurice McNutt, and helped the Indiana University and Harvard Law School graduate win his campaign for governor of Indiana. McNutt took notice of the young Serbian who acted like a college graduate and gave him a job. Eventually, he appointed Matt as captain of the newly restructured state police. Leach's department covered 7 districts, with sergeants, lieutenants, and detectives who all refused to cooperate across county lines. Leach also realized his force was too ill-equipped to fight the modern criminal. Indiana State Police had 1 armored car, no radio cars, and Leach's patrolmen only carried 1 gun and a badge. Their puny .32 and .38 revolvers were no match for the gangsters' weapon of choice, the .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun. It was created during World War I as a trench sweeper, but it was popularized back home by Al Capone's mob. It's also known as a Tommy gun, Chicago typewriter, and Chicago piano. The 1921 model, set on full automatic, could spit out an ear-shattering 800 rounds per minute. Bonus, its detachable stock made it easy to conceal. To make matters worse, while people needed permits and background checks to buy revolvers and pistols, a Thompson was considered a rifle and could be bought over the counter, no questions asked. And while the police departments had older model cars, gangsters bought or stole fast cars like Essex Terraplanes and Ford V8s, capable of speeds of 90 miles an hour. However, these cars were prone to breakdowns at such speeds and were absolute gas guzzlers. Gangsters started hiding jerry cans with gasoline along their escape routes to refuel during a getaway. They also carried roofing nails which they scattered behind them as they fled to ruin any pursuer's tires. But once they got a head start, the cops in their slow cars were toast, unless they had a 2-way radio. Most didn't. At best, the cops had 1-way radios. They could receive info, but not update the police stations or other cars. Lack of 2-way radios also meant there were no effective roadblocks. The TNT equation, Thompsons and Terraplanes, favored outlaws to a ridiculous degree, especially in states like Indiana and Illinois. Captain Leach's boss, Superintendent Alfini, wanted to keep Governor McNutt's election promise and get the police cars 2-way radio broadcasting systems like they had in Michigan and Pennsylvania. But they wanted banks and local businesses to fund it. It was destined to be a broken election promise. Undeterred, Captain Leach made do with what he had and reshaped the state police to be more effective. He imposed new rules of conduct: no gossip, no smoking cigar while in uniform, and no keeping company with persons of questionable character. He improved efficiency by creating a barracks system with rapid response teams. He also implemented the latest investigative methods and mixed them with his own theories. As one of few at the time, Leach believed in what we today call criminal profiling, using psychology to understand and outsmart criminals. He used his stutter and acted clumsy during interrogations to build rapport with suspects. He used and manipulated the press to draw criminals out, but many in the police force didn't appreciate this blabbermouth. They eventually stopped sharing information, fearing Leach might inadvertently tip off the criminals they were trying to catch. When Captain Matt Leach heard about the jumping yegg, he sent some mugshots over to the robbed banks and soon found out that Desperate Dan was in fact John Dillinger, a parolee from Indiana State Prison. He sent Dillinger's parole officer to pick him up in Mooresville. Johnny wasn't there, and the parole officer searched for him at all the known addresses, but the man was gone. By the time he got back to Mooresville, the officer found the policeman he'd left there to watch the farm asleep in their car. Johnny had simply strolled past them to bring his father a birthday present, a shirt and tie. Captain Leach put surveillance on the homes of Dillinger's father and sister Audrey and had Johnny's first partner in crime, Ed Singleton, arrested and brought in for questioning. Ed had nothing to offer other than that Dillinger Jr. wanted to put a bullet between his eyes. On August 8th, Clifford Moeller, James Kirkland, Homer Van Meter, and others robbed the People's Bank of Gravel Switch, Kentucky, taking home $13,180. Some say Dillinger was involved, but he wasn't. Neither was Maurice Lanham, who was arrested for the job after eyewitnesses picked his photo out of available mugshots. On August 10th, the Indiana State Police issued an all-points bulletin, an APB, for Dillinger, Copeland, Moeller, Kirkland, and Van Meter. But Captain Matt Leach was getting competition. The American Surety Company, the Montpelier's bank's insurance company, sent former Pinkerton detective and one of the original members of the Indiana Crime Bureau, Forrest C. Huntington, to investigate the robbery. Something was off. Captain Leach wasn't a detective, but he was still expected to chase down tips and lead raids and ambushes. However, he wasn't as well connected, well-informed, or well-funded as Huntington. The detective had many associates in Washington, D.C., a large database on Midwestern bank robbers, plus a healthy expense account. Huntington and associates hit the streets and dug up many clues. Huntington didn't like Leach, not even a little bit, because he was too chummy with the press. He tried to keep him out of the loop as much as possible, and Leach struggled to stay in the game. The detective went to the Indiana Reformatory at Pendleton to grill William Shaw. If the kid gave actionable intel, he promised to put in a good word. Shaw rapped that Dillinger often hid in Lebanon, Kentucky with an ex-con named Whitehouse. Shaw also sold out Shorty George Hughes, the weapons broker, detailed the car thefts, and revealed the address of the garage where the vehicles were stashed. Huntington questioned the garage owner. A man fitting Dillinger's description rented the place under the name Frank Monahan and also went by Clarence Cruz, both Dillinger aliases. Huntington then got Shaw to give an address Dillinger was using in East Chicago, Indiana. FYI, East Chicago is a city in Indiana, not a suburb of Chicago. Since the apartment was in the region, the police nickname for East Chicago, Huntington told Captain Leach. The captain's men broke down the door of said apartment and arrested 3 associates of Desperate Dan, but not Dan himself. John Dillinger was in Bluffton, Ohio, robbing a bank. The head cashier of Citizens National Bank of Bluffton, Ohio, Elmer G. Romney, was convinced his bank was next in line for a holdup. He showed his bosses the newspaper articles of a recent string of violent robberies and convinced them to put their vault on a time lock. Starting in August 1933, the bank went on the clock, which meant the vault could only be opened during a brief designated period. Shortly before noon on Monday, August 14th, a large green sedan with Indiana license plates pulled up in front of the building, facing the opposite direction. The engine kept running. Like a well-oiled machine, 5 men emerged from the vehicle. 2 stayed outside. 2, both dressed in gray suits and straw boater hats, entered the bank. The 5th man positioned himself just inside the front door. At the teller's window, one of the 2 frontmen asked assistant cashier Roscoe Klinger to change a 5 into 3 ones, $1 in dimes, and the rest in nickels. The man shoved the bills and coins in his pocket, then smoothly pulled out a handgun and whispered, "Stand back. This is a stick-up." The gang was trying a new approach. Instead of shouting, they went ASMR to announce bank robberies. When Charles Burkholder, an employee of the Farmers Grain Company, approached the window, ASMR guy, a gun in each hand, shoved him behind the counter to join Klinger. Then the second hold-up man vaulted over the head-high cage fence. He stuck the superhero landing and ordered bookkeeper Oliver Locker to hit the deck with Romney and Burkholder. Jumpin' Jack, well, we all know who he was, Dillinger emptied the content of the teller's drawer into a pillowcase. It wasn't much. He glared at Locker. "You got more than this? Where the hell is it?" Locker pointed to the big vault door right as the alarm began to blare. ASMR guy dropped his act and shouted, "They're after us, let's go!" Dillinger told him to chill. They had time. The town's waterworks whistle went off, the second alarm. Dillinger was still chill. He found a locked drawer and demanded the key. At the same time, the gang's lookout started firing to keep the growing crowd outside at bay. Slugs hit store windows and walls all over the area, and 2 Bluffton news reporters ducked for cover. But the residents figured all the noise was the boisterous legionnaires passing through town for a convention in Lima, Ohio. Merchant security officer Sidney Garrow ran into Greetings hardware store shouting for the guns. By the time he got them, the gang had piled into their car and made off with a disappointing take of $2,100 and a .32 revolver. Postmaster Dode Murray hid behind a brick column with a hefty .45, ready to shoot the bandits as they passed. But the green sedan squealed off in another direction, firing over the crowd as they went. The town marshal dropped his lunch and rushed over. There was pandemonium, but no gang. Witnesses said the getaway car was a Buick, an Essex, a Chrysler, a Pontiac, and a Chevrolet. The machine gun sticking out of the back window was a little distracting. When a gas station attendant said a Chevy headed down Riley Street, county sheriffs threw up roadblocks, but the mystery car, whatever model it really was long gone. Maurice Lanham handed Clifford Moeller's address in East Chicago to insurance company detective Forrest Huntington. On August 17, 1933, East Chicago police arrested someone named Clifford Martin, or Joseph Martin, and another man at the Travelers Inn. Huntington identified the man as Clifford Moeller through a tattoo, his appearance, and fingerprints on file in Washington, D.C. He was truly well connected. The other man was James Kirkland. Moeller squealed that John Dillinger and crew had rooms at the nearby Borland Avenue apartments. Off-team state police went, joined by less than enthusiastic East Chicago cops. The rooms were empty. Someone, East Chicago cops, must have tipped off the criminals. Not all was lost. They found receipts for work done on cars. One of the vehicles was registered to Fred Monahan, a Dillinger alias. Moeller, meanwhile, was the gift that kept on giving, or the rapper that kept on rapping. He gave a name: Homer Van Meter. American surety detective Forrest Huntington now linked John Dillinger, Harry Copeland, Sam Goldstein, and Homer Van Meter in the unsolved bank job at Bluffton, Ohio. Huntington was on a roll, and yet he never connected Shaw's info that this Dillinger was amassing a nest egg for his friends in prison, and Moeller never squeaked about the pending prison break. On August 18th, 6 men robbed the People's Savings Bank of Grand Haven, Michigan. In one of the cars abandoned by the bandits, police found a driver's license issued to Fred Monahan, one of Dillinger's aliases. So, was it his job? No. He'd merely lent the robbers one of his many stolen vehicles and left the license by accident. This job was masterminded by Lester Joseph Gillis, aka Babyface Nelson. Moeller was turned over to Leach and kept yakking. He admitted to several bank robberies, including the gravel switch job. Moeller hoped to get a deal from the Indiana State Police captain and ratted that Dan Donovan was living with Sam Goldstein at the Beverly Apartments in Gary, Indiana. Off-team state police went. However, the raid was pulled together at such short notice, Captain Leach had no time to cordon off the area, and he was short on men. He had to go to the state police barracks 18 miles away to get some. As he jumped in his car, he yelled at the garage man next door to call the police if anyone showed up. Mere minutes after Leach drove off, a terraplane pulled up at the complex. Leach returned with reinforcements and was less than thrilled to find out that the police had arrested the man who got out and let the driver go. They'd grabbed Goldstein, who'd been dropped off by John Dillinger. The garage guy complained that he had called Gary police about the terraplane, but they were like, meh. But lucky Leach. He told them that 3 men had left word for Goldstein to meet them at the Roadhouse 9 miles out of town. Off-team state police went, but Leach found no one at the Roadhouse. Goldstein's terraplane was confiscated and added to the police car fleet. Unlike Moeller, Goldstein was no rapper. He was too old to crack under interrogation and told Leach nothing. The bandits associated with Dillinger were dropping like flies. Freddie Brenman was also caught. On August 25, 1933, Detective Forrest Huntington contacted the Dayton Police Department to inform them that John Dillinger had a girlfriend in Dayton, Ohio. He had no address or married name, but she was the sister of James Jenkins, an inmate at Michigan City. Also, Dillinger is driving a new Essex Terraplane 8 sedan black color and is probably using Indiana license 418673. A phone call to Michigan City produced the name of Mary Longacre. The letter she'd written to her brother James revealed her address. Inspector Seymour Yendes of the Dayton Police Department ordered 2 Dayton detectives, Russell K. Fall and Charlie E. Gross, to swing by Longacre's rooming house. They showed Johnny's picture to the landlady, Lucille Stricker, who confirmed that the man was a friend of her tenant, Mary Longacre. The man often wrote letters, and Stricker volunteered to call detectives when the next one arrived. Meanwhile, Mary's letters to Dillinger telling him to come over were all returned to sender. Her boyfriend was very shifty, careful. Finally, a letter dated August 25th got through. She warned him of a medical problem she couldn't commit to paper. And no, it wasn't that. She had recently seen her husband, and he wasn't gonna contest the divorce. If you could come over Sunday, I want to see you so bad. I had my picture taken. They aren't so hot, though. I sure don't take a good picture. Dillinger indeed came that Sunday, driving the new Essex, license 418673, but he wasn't seen. Lucky duck. A few days later, the landlady called the detectives to say a letter had arrived from Johnny to Mary. It read, I'll be seeing you soon." Excited, detectives Fall and Gross convinced landlady Nosy Rosie to rent them a room across the hall from Mary's. Only Dillinger would be allowed upstairs, and once he knocked on Mary's door, they'd open the door and shoot to kill point blank. The only other man allowed upstairs was Captain Leach, but he'd call first. And so, the men waited in the unlit apartment, their ears tuned for footsteps. An hour later, someone raced up the stairs. The detectives threw open the door, ready to shoot, but they realized just in time that the man at the door was tall and thin, not short and stocky like Dillinger. Leach called out, "Don't shoot, it's me!" Captain Dumbbutt had forgotten his own instructions. He'd raced upstairs in his excitement because he'd gotten intel that Dillinger was at a restaurant. "Let's go!" Off they went. When they got there, John was already gone. Lucky duck. John Dillinger added another like-minded parolee to his gang, Hilton Crouch's brother-in-law, John Vinson. 24-year-old Vinson had served time for a bank robbery in Mohawk, Indiana. On September 6, 1933, Dillinger, Vinson, and Crouch arrived at the Massachusetts Avenue State Bank in Indianapolis near the state police headquarters. Assistant bank manager Lloyd Reinhardt was sitting at his desk chatting on the phone when he heard someone say, "This is a stick-up. We mean business." It sounded so fake he didn't even glance up and continued the conversation. "Get off that damn telephone!" Reinhardt turned to see Dillinger, a straw hat tilted smugly on his head, sitting cross-legged on top of the 7-foot-high barrier, casually pointing an automatic at his face. This was no joke. Reinhardt and a cashier raised their hands. 2 patrons also raised their hands, but Dillinger told them to lower them. Raised arms could alert passers-by. He herded everyone into a corner. The customers just stood there, hands at their sides, while Dillinger forced the employees to lie on the floor. Vinson trained his gun on them as Dillinger gracefully dropped to the floor and headed to the vault. He began flinging sacks of cash over the cage to Vinson. They had hit the jackpot, the Real Silk Hosiery Company's payroll. The load became extra heavy when Dillinger discovered a cache of $1,500. The jittery Vinson, struggling to keep his handkerchief mask from slipping down, kept pestering Dillinger to hurry it up. Johnny remained calm. Minutes later, the pair backed out with the heavy bags, hopped into a blue DeSoto, and wheelman Hilton Crouch burned rubber up Michigan Avenue. Just like that, the gangsters were gone. The take was Dillinger's biggest to date. A whopping $24,800, nearly $600,000 today. It was the second most successful bank robbery in the state, all right under the nose of the Indiana State Police headquarters, where Captain Leach was tearing his hair out. He swore to unleash every force of the law against this flamboyant jerkface. Johnny divided the loot on the way to Chicago, then the gang parted company. Vincent took his $8,000 and laid so low he was never heard from again. Dillinger now had enough dough to fund the prison break, but it would keep him busy for the next few weeks, and Sweet Mary would have to wait. For the past 3 months, Dillinger had stayed in touch with everyone who promised to help Harry Pierpont and crew escape. Dillinger's main contact, a team escapee on the inside, was 22-year-old Mary Kinder, a petite lady with a fondness for flashy clothes, red shoes, fabulous rouge, and stunning lipstick. Mary had an ex-husband, a brother, and a sweetheart doing time at Michigan City. Her ex, Dil Kinder, son of an Indianapolis police sergeant, was in for robbing a grocery store. Her brother, Earl Northern, was in for a Kokomo bank robbery, as was his partner and her sweetheart, Harry Pierpont. She promised to help Dillinger organize the mass breakout under one condition. Her brother Earl had to be added to the list of escapees. John assigned Kinder the job of providing clothing and finding an apartment in Indianapolis for up to 14 men. Many a successful breakout had been thwarted for lack of a good hideout. Another partner in the breakout was Kokomo Madam Pearl Elliott. Elliott's brother had been another one of Pierpont's partners in a bank robbery, but he hadn't been caught. Since Pierpont hadn't snitched, Pearl felt she owed him. She passed money to a partner who bribed the guards at the prison. Dillinger also used lawyer and fixer Omar Brown to grease some palms of parole board members to get Pierpont out the legal way, to no avail. Handsome Harry's reputation as a jailbreaker had his parole quickly and forcefully denied. Plan B. Pierpont sent his mom Lena to Captain Leach at the Indiana State House. In that era, mothers were considered vital to a wayward son's reformation, but Lena couldn't get past the receptionist. She handed over a letter for the captain, in which Pierpont offered to track down Dillinger and Copeland in exchange for his parole. This was the first time Captain Leach heard of Handsome Harry and declined the offer. He figured this was simply a lone wolf escape plan. It is unclear what Pierpont's real plan was. The list of Indiana State Prison inmates joining the breakout had grown since John Dillinger left. Gang leader Harry Pete Pierpont decided who made the cut. Team Escapee's core members, of course. Charles Makeley, a 44-year-old former insurance agent from Ohio, had a long criminal record, but was currently serving 10 to 20 years for a robbery in Indiana. He was pretty chill in prison and was the comedian in the gang. John Red Hamilton, a 34-year-old red-headed carpenter from Canada, was a quiet guy, liked by everyone. He was in his third year of his 25-year sentence for robbing a gasoline filling station. Though he had only committed minor offenses in prison, the prison board thought him too dangerous to parole. He was also called Three-Fingered Jack because he had lost 2 fingers in a freak slaying accident as a kid. Russell Clark, a 35-year-old average sort of fella from Terre Haute, Indiana, was tall and handsome with a small black mustache. He was in year 6 of a 20-year sentence for a bank robbery. Plus, when he had returned from testifying in another robbery, he tried to kill his guard. He had since made several escape attempts. Per Dillinger's request, Mary Longacre's brother James Jenkins had been added. He had completed 2 years of a life sentence for murder. He'd panicked during a store robbery and shot the owner who reached inside his cash register. The Baron Lahm associate, Walter Dietrich, had served 2 years of a life sentence for the Clinton, Indiana bank robbery. He got another partner of Baron Lahm on the list, 31-year-old James Oklahoma Jack Clark, no relation to Russell Clark, who had also been captured at the Clinton job. James wasn't interested in the breakout, but Dietrich convinced him that on the outside, he could get medical care for his awful stomach ulcers. Also added were 28-year-old Edward Schaus in his third year of a 25-year sentence for robbery, Joseph Fox in year 3 of a life sentence for robbery, John Burns, a mysterious character whose real name, John Heaps, was revealed decades later in his 13th year on a life sentence for murder committed during a bank robbery, and of course Mary Kinder's brother, Earl the Kid Northern. John Dillinger and Harry Copeland, staying at Pearl Elliott's Kokomo hideout, prepared to deliver guns to the inmates at the Indiana State Prison. Dillinger had bought 3 .38 automatic pistols with spare clips and ammunition for $48 each. They packed the weapons individually in Chicago newspapers, wrapped them in cotton, covered the packages with roofing tar, and rolled them in sand to make them look like sandstone. On or about the night of August 10th, they took the stones, drove to Michigan City, parked several blocks from the prison, and walked to the walls. They located the markers made by one of the inmates, a white piece of board hung from the window of the shirt factory with a painted red arrow pointing in the direction of where the gun should be tossed over the fence. Apparently, the prison guards and officials either never saw the markers or thought it was some kind of inside joke, or, well, you know, bribes. It took Pitcher Dillinger several tries to hurl the stones over the 25-foot wall. Early the next morning, Walter Dietrich picked up the packages and hid the guns and ammo in a shoebox in the basement of the shirt shop warehouse. A few days later, Dillinger tossed another fake stone containing 3 more guns over the wall. This time, 2 convicts noticed a strange sticky stone. Hoping to collect some favors, they warned a guard. Deputy Warden Claudy cracked open the rock and seized the guns. Shock, horror, surprise! A breakout was being planned. For some reason, Claudy didn't suspect Pierpont's gang and instead accused a recent arrival, Daniel McGogan, a notorious Chicago beer runner and gunman, and his 2 bank robber friends, Jack Gray and Edward Murphy, and placed the trio in solitary confinement. A persistent story ignores the delivery of the first package and says that after the seizure of this second faux rock, Pierpont contacted Dillinger with instructions to send guns in a specially marked box of threads. However, this story appears to have been a deliberate invention of Walter Dietrich. More about that in another episode. Speaking of inventions, John Dillinger was accused of a September 12th holdup of the S.J. Gully State Bank in Farrell, Pennsylvania, with a take of $6,000, killing a police officer in the process. However, as his career unfolded, he ended up accused of just about every bank robbery and holdup in the country months after the fact, some of which he'd committed weeks before his parole. Johnny specifically avoided Pennsylvania because their police cars had two-way radios, making an escape that much harder. Still, on September 15th, Dillinger returned to Chicago with a big bag of money and had to get his pretty beat-up Terraplane fixed in a garage. So, he'd been up to something. On September 18, 1933, Dillinger visited Mary Kinder at her Indianapolis home to give her $150 for her expenses. The boys would arrive September 27th at the earliest, maybe 4 days later. Then, for the first time in a month, Dillinger had time to visit Mary Longacre. On September 20th, the two Dayton police detectives, Russell Fall and Charlie Gross, who'd been on round-the-clock surveillance of Mary Longacre's apartment for 2 weeks now, had had enough of each other's faces. They went home to sleep in their own beds. The detectives told Mrs. Stricker to call police headquarters if Dillinger ever returned. The next day, September 21st, the landlady heard someone come up the stairs and enter Mary's room. She saw the fancy Terraplane parked outside. Bingo! She dialed the police station around midnight. Sergeant W.J. Aldridge answered the phone. "He's here." "Who's there?" "John Dillinger, you dumb flatfoot." Within half an hour, Fall and Gross were underway with Sergeant Aldridge. By 1:30 a.m., the house was surrounded by uniformed police. Mrs. Stryker led the detectives and sergeant in through the back door. Aldridge took up position at the bottom of the stairs while the landlady led the detectives up the carpeted stairs. Gross, with a Thompson machine gun, and Fall, with a 12-gauge riot gun, stood on either side of the doorframe and signaled unarmed Mrs. Stricker to knock and announce herself. Mary opened the door, which allowed the detectives to peek around the corner. In the middle of the living room stood a man in an undershirt and gray suit pants holding a stack of Kodak pictures. Gross moved in while Fall shouted, "Stick 'em up, John! We're police officers!" Dillinger slowly raised his hands to his shoulders. The pictures fell, and he lowered his hands a little. Fall entered with his big shotgun aimed at Dillinger's head. "Don't, John. I'll kill you." Johnny froze. Mary suddenly fake fainted at his feet, but the officers didn't buy the act. Gross feared the setup and ordered Mary to get on her hands and knees and carefully crawl over to him. Fall told Dillinger that if he hadn't put up his hands, he could have been shot. Dillinger, trying hard to hide his disgust, countered, "When you fellas came in, you said you were police, but I didn't know. I thought maybe you were part of another gang. I can only tell if they wear uniforms." With Johnny handcuffed on the couch, the police searched the room. They found 2 guns on his person, a .38 automatic between the sofa cushions, and 5 pistols inside a suitcase. A search of the Terraplane outside yielded $2,604 in cash, ammunition, and a sack of roofing nails. John Dillinger was headed to prison, mere days from his buddy's planned breakout. He could only hope they succeeded, because he was sure Harry Pierpont and gang would return the favor and break him out. Well, we'll find out in the next episode. See you there.